Let's take a look at our global modules, timeline items, and activities. We'll start with timeline items. And right away we can notice that here we're importing the data from another global module, activities. And even though this activities array is no longer used in this module, because now the code is commented out, but still we were referencing the data from another global store directly in this global store. And now if we're gonna take a look at another global store, activities, here we can see that we are importing function from another global store, timeline items. So these two global modules are a little bit coupled, because we are directly importing data and functions inside these modules from each other. So what I suggest is to make these two modules, timeline items and activities, completely decoupled from each other. But before that, let's actually rename this function getActivityProgress and assign more meaningful name. For example, we can call this function calculateActivityCompletion%. So let's go ahead and replace the previous function name inside progress item component and use new name calculateActivityCompletion%, and also in this place where we're using this function inside this computed property. And while we're here, let's also rename this computed property on percentage and also change all references of this property in our template for the width of the scale and here for the number shown under this scale. And now let's actually get to decoupling global modules. So in order to decouple activity module from timeline items, we have to get rid of this import of the function getTotalActivitySeconds. First of all, let's see where we're using this function inside this module. It is happening right here inside calculateActivityCompletion%. So let's just cut this function call from here, and we're going to pass this value from outside into this function as a parameter called TrackedSeconds. So let's also declare this new parameter right here. And now we have to go back to progress item component and find where calculateActivityPercentage function is used. And now since it takes second parameter, and in here we need to reference activity object by using props object like this. And by doing this refactoring, now we're able to completely remove that import of getTotalActivitySeconds function from activities module, since this function is no longer used in here. So inside progress item component, we already have an import for getTotalActivitySeconds function, but why don't we rename this function on something more meaningful? I'm going to select all occurrences of this function in this file and assign different name. For example, let's call this function calculateTrackedActivitySeconds. As a reminder, this function calculates amount of tracked time by now for a particular activity. And of course, let's also rename this function declaration inside timeline items module. So here I'm going to assign a new name to this function. And now a little bit off topic, but still, let's go inside activities module, find the function calculateActivityCompletion%, and right here we're passing activity object as the first parameter, but in fact we're only referencing one property of this object in the body of this function. So let's just apply the structuring to this parameter and extract seconds to complete property, like so. Let's continue, and now we have to replace one more occurrence of the function that we have previously renamed on calculateTrackedActivitySeconds. So let's go inside ActivitySeconds to complete component, and let's just replace getTotalActivitySeconds function call on the new name. And of course, same thing should be done with an import statement. Here we're using the new name. And now we can go ahead and remove that import of unused array activities inside timeline items module. And this way we have made these two modules, timeline items and activities, totally decoupled from each other. So there is actually one more thing that I'd like to do in this lesson, and that is related to hasActivity function. So right now this function is used as a condition, but not as a filtering function. So let's just try to create another function which will be responsible for filtering timeline items by a particular activity. This function will be filter timeline items by activity, which is going to take activity object by which we have to filter timeline items array. And now let's find those places where we're applying this filtering, for example inside resetTimelineItem activities function. So let's cut these two lines and here use our new function, filter timeline items by activity, and pass in activity object as the first parameter. And what we need to do now is actually paste that filtering logic inside filter timeline items by activity function. And also notice that as activity function is only used in one place now, that is inside this function. So there is no need to keep that function around anymore. We can cut this condition and use it directly inside this function filter timeline items by activity. And now as activity function can also go away. So we can also reuse our new filtering function in one more place, and that is inside calculate tracked activity seconds. So right here we're going to replace the first two lines on our new function call, and this way we were able to reduce amount of duplicated code in this module just a little bit, but still that was a valuable refactoring. So now let's just take a closer look at the reduce method. So this method is used to find the sum of all activity seconds values of all timeline item objects, and also inside the closure of the reduce function we are only referencing one property of timeline item object, and that is activity seconds. So why don't we split these two concerns? First of all, we can call method map to go over all timeline item objects and extract only property that we need, and that is activity seconds. And after this we're gonna get a new array which consists only of values of activity second properties of every timeline item object, and then by applying method reduce we can actually simplify this closure to make it shorter. So for example, we can rename the first parameter on just total, and the second parameter, instead of accepting timeline object, now we'll accept only value of activity seconds property. So now this closure is going to look like this. Let's just swap these two operands around, and now we have a final version of this function, which in my opinion looks more clear than previous implementation. And by the way, I have forgotten to return the value from filter timeline items by activity function. So in here we have to add keyword return. And if you wish, we can also apply the structure into some parameters in this function. So for example, here we can destructure property ID, and in this closure we can destructure property activity ID, and then we'll compare these two variables. In this case, maybe the code has become less readable, but we were able to make it a little bit shorter. And you can actually decide yourself which implementation looks better to you. I'm gonna go with this one. And actually I have missed one more return inside timeline items module. So right here we also have to return the value from this function calculate tracked activity seconds. And now just to see if we haven't broken anything, let's start tracking time for the coding activity and make sure that on activities page the time will be decreasing, and on the progress page the scale will be growing. And even when our stopwatch is running, we still can change activity, and on the progress page it will affect different scale now. And finally, let's just reset the time of the stopwatch and make sure that all percentages on the progress page will be 0. And as we can see, everything is working as expected. Let's continue development in the next lesson.